The Premier of New South Wales has faced a grilling in Question Time over her relationship with disgraced former MP Daryl Maguire. Gladys Berejiklian's revelation of her 5-year affair with the man, who's the subject of an ICAC investigation, left her colleagues stunned. In a rowdy Question Time today, the opposition leader Jodie McKay stepped up her calls for the Premier to resign.
Premier, given your legal obligation to report corruption under the Independent Commission Against Corruption Act, why did you fail to report Daryl Maguire's actions despite knowing of his business dealings with property developers for 6.5 years? Why, Premier, did you not
You've asked the
act
question,
as
Leader of the Opposition.
But the Premier's senior colleagues are firmly behind their leader, for now anyway. I spoke to the New South Wales Attorney-General Mark Speakman a short time ago and asked him if news of the affair came as a surprise to him.
Look, I think it came as a surprise to just about everybody in the New South Wales Parliament. None of us knew that the Premier had this close personal relationship with Mr Maguire, so it was a surprise.
Are you disappointed she kept the relationship from you and her other colleagues?
Well, look, the Premier has said that her language was that she's, I think stuffed up was her language about her personal life. That's a matter for the Premier, her personal life. But what is important in New South Wales is that the government gets down to business and continues what we've been doing for the last 12 months, which is until recently fighting the worst drought in New South Wales history.
Terrible.
The worst bushfire season in New South Wales history.
Terrible.
And now a 1-in-100-year pandemic.
Also terrible.
So what the Premier has done, I think, has shown exemplary leadership. It's hard to identify a leader of government anywhere else in the world who has managed to keep a relative lid on coronavirus on the one hand, but keep jobs going and the economy going on the other hand.
Wrap up the bullshit.
That wasn't the question, though. I said, do you think it was the wrong decision not to tell her colleagues, given, of course, these issues around conflict of interest and the fact that he was involved in these deals? He's at the centre of an ICAC investigation.
Well, look, the Premier has said that she kept her public life and her private life separate, that she was very confident she could do that. And what is clear, that in her public life, she has been exemplary. She has led this state through a 1-in-100-year pandemic. She has kept coronavirus numbers under relative control and, unlike much of the world, kept the economy and jobs going without severe lockdowns.
So you don't think she should have told you as a Cabinet Minister earlier?
Well, look, I've had a conversation with the Premier about the issue. That remains private. But what is...
Did you... Okay, I won't ask you to quote what she said, but what did you express? Did you say it would have been useful to know this earlier?
Well, look, that conversation remains confidential, but what is important is that there's been no allegation put to her at ICAC of a breach of her ministerial code of conduct. She is leading this state in an exemplary fashion, and people in New South Wales want to see us beat coronavirus. They want to see numbers suppressed. They want to see jobs and the economy moving, and that's what this Premier is doing, and that's what the whole government is doing. We are focused on delivering safety and health and jobs and prosperity and quality services for the people of New South Wales.
There's no doubt that people want those things, but they also want corruption to be kept out of their politics. That's why ICAC exists. Was it a mistake for Gladys Berejiklian to keep seeing this man after, of course, he was sacked, she'd sacked him over his business dealings, and to continue this relationship?
The Premier has expressed her regret about that. I don't think me adding commentary from the sidelines adds anything to that. But what is important is that people in New South Wales expect their governments to get down to business, to be handling what is the biggest thing on our agenda, which is the 1-in-100-year pandemic.
What was your assessment of Daryl Maguire?
He is being assessed by ICAC at the moment. It's inappropriate for me, particularly as the first law officer of New South Wales, to be commenting on that until ICAC has finished taking evidence and then making findings and recommendations.
Did you feel like he was dodgy?
Because the matter is before ICAC at the moment, it would be inappropriate for me to offer commentary at this stage about my personal assessment of Daryl Maguire.
Will Gladys Berejiklian be the Premier of New South Wales by the end of the week?
I believe so. I believe so. She is, I think, the strongest, one of the strongest government leaders in the world. And as I've said before, the record is in a 1-in-100-year pandemic. We have fought that pandemic, kept numbers relatively suppressed, kept the economy going, kept people in jobs better than probably any other government.
Would you put your hand up for the job if she steps down?
Well, I don't think that's going to arise. I think.
But would you?
Say the Premier,
are you interested in the leadership if the scenario were to arise?
Yeah. Look, I'm not going to jump at shadows. What I am going to express, though, is my strong support for Gladys Berejiklian. She is an outstanding Premier. She has done an outstanding job, shown outstanding leadership in making sure that New South Wales gets through this pandemic.
Should the rules be changed to prevent parliamentary secretaries from conducting business outside of Parliament? I got to say, when I realised that can happen, I thought, this is breathtaking. Is this seriously allowed to happen? Should the rules now change?
Well, look, that's an interesting question. Ministers under our ministerial code of conduct are not allowed secondary employment or secondary businesses, so we can't do anything else but be ministers of the Crown. I imagine that ICAC might make some recommendations about the position of parliamentary secretaries in particular, and MPs more generally when they finish this inquiry.
What's your instinct? Of course you'll take those recommendations, but do you think that's a problem in the current rules?
Well, look, I'll await the ICAC recommendations, but it's pretty clear that our number one priority as members of Parliament and as members of the government is to serve the people of New South Wales without any conflict of interest.
You're setting up a parliamentary inquiry to examine coercive control as a form of domestic violence. Would you like to see it criminalised? We
want to give very serious consideration to that because coercive control is abhorrent for two reasons. It involves an ongoing pattern of financial, psychological, emotional, social abuse that basically strips victims, survivors, of their autonomy and their self-worth and their independence. So it's abhorrent for that reason. Almost every domestic violence homicide in New South Wales has been preceded by a pattern of coercive control. So it's a strong predictor of that risk, and if we can intervene in perpetrators' behaviours before it escalates to that tragic end, that's a good thing. I want to look very closely at the experience in Scotland, which criminalised coercive control in 2019, the experience in England and Wales, which criminalised coercive control in 2015, and see what lessons there are for New South Wales and whether we should be going down that path. So it's something I am very seriously interested in, but it is something that requires very thorough and comprehensive consultation. We want to hear from victim survivors, we want to hear from frontline workers. We want to make sure that we don't end up with a beautifully crafted law that looks great in theory, but the police on the ground can't implement. And we want to make sure that we don't overstep the mark.
Yeah, what are the challenges? I think you've just pointed to some, but in criminalising non-physical domestic violence and proving the offence, which is the really difficult bit, in court.
That is difficult because, with domestic and family violence, often you're looking at single incidents of physical assault. With coercive control, you're looking at a pattern of behaviour and maybe individual instances that taken in isolation you wouldn't regard as criminal.
Do you believe that this coercive control is actually more widespread in Australian relationships in your state?
Anecdotally, I think it is pretty widespread. We know that 1 in 6 women since the age of 15 across Australia have been the victims of physical violence at the hands of a current or former intimate partner. That's a pretty reliable estimate because it doesn't come from police crime data, which may be underreported. It comes from surveys, robust statistical surveys undertaken by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And we know that in the worst cases, domestic violence homicide, it is almost always preceded by coercive control.
Tasmania is the only Australian jurisdiction that actually has introduced criminal offences covering elements of coercive control. How many successful prosecutions have there been? Are you looking at Tasmania as well?
Well, we'll look at Tasmania. My understanding is at least until a year or two ago, there were very few successful prosecutions in Tasmania, maybe single numbers. And that's why it's important to make sure that any legislation we bring in New South Wales is operational and police can implement it, and why we need to look at the experience in Scotland and England and Wales, where there have been hundreds of prosecutions, mostly successful.
And what do you make of Labor's call for a 10-year penalty for coercive control?
One of the things we'll have to look at is what is an appropriate maximum penalty. In one of those UK jurisdictions, it's 14 years, it's 5 years in another. In most of the cases in England and Wales and Scotland, imprisonment is not the sentence, it's a lesser sentence, and that may be appropriate where what you want to do is intervene in perpetrators' behaviour, usually men, and change that behaviour before it escalates. So even if you're not sending people to prison, if you can intervene in people's behaviour, make them go to men's behaviour change programs, you can avoid the sort of tragic circumstances we see all too often right across Australia.
That's the New South Wales Attorney General Mark Speakman. 0418 226 576 is our text line.